Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. Thanks very much for attending. We're still seeing quite a few attendees join, so we're just going to leave it a couple of minutes to let everyone else filter on, and then we'll get underway. Thanks for your patience. So good morning, everyone. Again, thanks very much for joining the webinar this morning. We're going to be looking today at identification and verification in the contact center, specifically sort of best practice around that, how we can look at lowering costs, improving security, and ultimately delighting our customers. I'm Steve Murray, Applications Director at IPI. So I look after the team who develop and deliver our self-service capabilities into our customers, and I'll be taking you through the presentation today. We're going to be running some polling questions as well. So in the GoToWebinar pane, you'll have the ability to participate within those questions. Please do. Always interesting to get the views of obviously the operational folks there on the call. And then we'll also be running a Q&A at the end. So again, using the questions panel within the GoToWebinar pane, you'll be able to field questions to myself about the content of the webinar today, or indeed anything else you may want to ask me. So today we're going to obviously we've done the intros. We're going to look at sort of where the market's at, and then have a run through authentication, sort of the history of it, and where it is today, and look at doing it badly, and you know what that actually means from a sort of financial, customer experience, and securities perspective. We're going to look at some of the techniques we can use to improve that and deliver a better experience to our customers. And then look at the sort of the business case for actually sort of justifying that. We all might think it's a good idea. We probably know it's a good idea, but what do we need to be looking at specifically, to convince the finance director or CFO that this is a worthwhile endeavour. We're then going to look at a real life customer case study and how that sort of impacted their business. As I said, we'll then go into some Q&A as well. So we always like to start by looking at where the market's at today. What are the sort of factors and pressures which are sort of pushing and pulling the contact center, and how we engage and interact with our customers. So some of these will probably ring true with many of you on the phone. The first one is really the omni-channel is sort of going to be considered the norm. Over 80% of the UK population now are in possession of a smartphone, and we have this device in the palm of our hand, which is capable of accessing information, applications, social media, and we expect to be able to sort of switch channel, cross-channel, and really sort of use that to help our engagement, via our chosen and preferred contact method. Topped with that, customers' need for speed will grow further as well. Again, coming back to this point that we are now as individuals, always connected, constantly engaging with the IoT. This view of speed and wanting to get things done, and really impatience is really prevalent within the market today. On top of that, customers are expecting more personalized experiences. In fact, they're demanding more personalized experiences. This concept of big data has been around for many years now, but it's actually about how we apply that to personalization in terms of relevant offers. If a customer's perhaps bought a product or service from us, well, actually, is there a complementary service we can offer which will increase their propensity to buy instead of something that's completely irrelevant that's just going to annoy them? But we have to do that in an ethical fashion as well. Data is constantly in the news, and organizations' poor treatment of customer data is now constantly in the news. GDPR it being one of the hugest pressures, which is now hitting the sort of national headlines with some significant fines. So we have to do that in the right way. An interesting new one, which over the last couple of years has really been affecting, is this increasing millennial demographic. So individuals born after 1981 who've grown up with using everyday technology, which some of the older members of the webinar may not have experienced in their youth, have a very different expectation on sort of frictionless engagement and how they need to be interacting. And that's not just as consumers, that's also as staff as well. So millennial employees have a much higher expectation of the sort of working environment and the flexibility which you need to provide for them as contact center management. Ultimately, customers are more educated as well. So again, coming back to this point that we're always talking, always out on social media, on the Twitter sphere, blogs. Martin Lewis might come on the TV on a morning and talk about a new particular gas or electricity tariff. We're always talking, so that higher level of education, and if we're not getting the service expectation that we want, we will vote with our feet. So we're now going to look at our first polling question. Which of these challenges are you finding the greatest? So if we could just take a moment for you to let us know which of those are sort of most important within your business at the moment. We can see lots of responses flooding in, so thank you for that. We'll just give it another few moments for everybody to answer, and then we'll publish those results in real time. So actually, yeah, so looking at that, omnichannel seems to be one of the biggest challenges that everyone's facing, and also that ability for to deal quickly with customers inquiries being the next one. Interesting stuff. Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, so legacy authentication. Well, historically, we've always sort of seen three major challenges with legacy authentication, with authentication coming into the contact center. This has typically been agent-led. It's been a frustrating, mundane process. In fact, 10% of agent-led identification and verification actually fails, which is a headache not only for the agents, but obviously more so for the end customer as well. And what we've seen as well is that actually 30% of customers experience difficulties or friction within that ID&V process. The impact of that, of course, is time as well. So it's time for the customer. Perhaps they have to have a differing method of authentication, a password reset, an account reset, which may result in white mail being sent out to them, to their home address, so that we can be sure that we're resetting that account correctly. And ultimately, that's time consuming, and it applies a cost to the customer and frustration to the customer. But of course, there's a distinct cost to the business there. The time spent handling that, and of course, then the time spent with that process for revalidation and authentication, if they've had a total failure. What's more, it's a security and compliance overhead as well, with dedicated teams there checking that DPA process, that ID&V process has been followed, and ultimately, it's not a great experience. So authentication today, well, on average in the UK contact center, that ID&V process, that agent-led ID&V process, takes around 38 seconds. And 66% of contacts, even though we're in this sort of omni-channel world, 66% of those contacts are still arriving via the voice channel. Research has shown that actually many of the major retailers and B2C companies are actually switching or reducing the functionality within their mobile applications now. they've not been shown to deliver the ROI that many organizations were hoping for. So that functionality is being reduced down so that ongoing development costs and support costs can be realized as well. In fact, 85% of customers are dissatisfied with their authentication experience when contacting a UK-based contact center. So off the back of that, we've got another question for you guys to answer, and that's really to get a feel for how many of you are still using agent-led ID&V within your own contact center. So only two choices, but if we could get your views on that, it would be very interesting. And we can see those polling answers coming in, and we'll just publish that. Yeah, so as we can see, overwhelmingly, many of us are still stuck in that sort of legacy world with agent-led identification and verification. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So, what is the cost of that? What's the cost of manual or even worse, bad authentication? Well, it's estimated that in the UK last year, the actual cost of that was £2.1 billion. That is significant, clearly, but more than that, around 10% of that fails, and as I said, 30% still results in a poor experience or increased friction for the customer. What's worse, though, is that actually 6.64% of all consumers in the UK were victims of fraud in 2017. Dramatic figures, and in fact, it's now possible to obtain a UK citizen's full details for less than £25 a record. Worryingly, as of 2018, personal data overtook oil in terms of its value. So yeah, this is the new sort of currency which many fraudsters are trading in. Underpinning that as well is that actually 80% of practitioners, so the individuals running contact centers, don't believe that they can deliver a service to match the promise of the brand. So the marketing and the messaging that's going out there to customers, we feel as contact center practitioners is clearly ahead of what we can actually deliver in terms of people, process, and technology within our organizations. So that kind of leads us on to what our customers actually want and expect. And ultimately, as we sort of alluded to before, what that expectation is a sort of seamless, frictionless experience. So the preferred route for consumers, as we saw from one of the previous slides where we talked about 66% of that traffic still coming into that voice channel, the preferred route for customers, including millennials, is still to use their voice. Now, that's interesting. The UK itself is the world's third largest market for speech self-service adoption. So we're behind the US and China for that. And Alexa is projected to make Amazon 5% of its global revenue by 2021. Now, this is anecdotal, but when even my 66-year-old mother gets up in the morning and asks Alexa how the weather's going to be today, and then to play smooth radio in the morning, you can really appreciate that the ease and natural use of that interface can be adopted by both the very young and the more senior, should we say, as well. She wouldn't like me to call her old. More than that, Google Home family, including devices like Nest, is projected to make over £8 billion in 2020 as well. So for me, what's really interesting there is that these traditionally keyboard-based, click-based businesses are now really focusing their time and attention onto using this voice interface to actually allow users to interact with them in a very easy, natural fashion. So we've got another quick question here for you guys, and this is around your own use and adoption of these technologies. So do you use any of those sort of speech assistants or voice assistants at home or indeed in work to help you out? And really, how regularly is that? So we can see the poll answers coming in. Still got a couple of responses coming in. And I think we can publish that. So quite interesting there that that actually half never use at the moment an assistant in that way. However, we can see a quarter are actually using that and adopting that technology every single day. So actually interesting findings. So how can we apply this to the contact center? Well, there's a number of different techniques that we can use to do that. One of the key alternatives to agent-led ID&V is to actually utilize a speech recognition interface, again with the option for a technology called Voice Biometric authentication to do this. So again, it's really about removing that sort of mundane 38-second on average, repeatable process from the agents, removing that security and compliance overhead, and allowing that to be done in a very seamless, natural way with an interaction between a speech recognition interface and the customer. And the sort of two approaches, which can be done independently or indeed teamed together, are using speech recognition to capture certain key pieces of information. And this is, we're talking around things like knowledge-based authentication. Excuse me. So the tokens which the agent would ask the customer today, for example, most contact centers would perhaps use 5 or 6 tokens and perhaps randomize 3 or 4 of them, depending on the internal processes and audits that you need to apply. Perhaps a CLI, we can do an initial match on the customer's number as they're delivering in. That may deliver a basic level of recognition, so that device is owned by that particular individual. It could be them. We then move into actually then interacting with the customer through that speech recognition interface, and we could collect things like account numbers, postcodes, perhaps first line of address, etc. We then move through, and once we've collected all that data within the ID&V application, we will then have an authenticated, validated or not customer, and we can transfer that through to an agent with a screen pop as well. Now, what that does is clearly very obvious. We're removing that need for the customer to perhaps handle that agent's sensitive data, but removing the 38 seconds of that upfront call as well, ensuring that we also play any compliance messages that the customer may need to listen to, again, to avoid the agent having to repeat the same stock data protection greeting on every single occasion. But what we can also do is a bit more than that, because everyone's had a frustrating experience with that authentication process. We can ensure that data can be then appended to the call, as it may or may not be transferred around the business, avoiding the requirement for additional authentication then on that call transfer. Not that I'm sure any of the contact centers on this webinar have a problem with the internal transfers of customers, he says with a wink that you can't see. Taking that a stage further though, we can then start to apply within that process biometric capabilities, specifically voice biometric capabilities. So this concept of biometrics is not new. In fact, the ancient Babylonians actually had used fingerprints to sign contracts as early as 200 BC. The first sort of practical adoption of sort of biometrics, though, was by the Argentine chief of police in 1892, when he created the first method of actually recording fingerprints for criminal investigations. Now, we're not talking about that. We're talking about actually using voice as the biometric value to authenticate callers. Again, this isn't a new concept, though, and the first patents for voice biometrics capability were filed over 60 years ago now. But this biometric capability is proven already within millions of consumer devices, unwittingly used by some and knowledgeably used by others. It started with Touch ID, for example, within the iPhone in terms of those smartphone devices, and we now, of course, have Face ID as well. So this concept of voice biometrics and using the voice print, the unique voice print, is a capability now that's not just the preserve of major banks and government agencies. This technology is now available at a price point and a delivery that's available for mid-market and smaller market contact centers to start adopting and using. We're now over that adoption curve where those initial deployments were clearly very, very expensive. 90% of consumers would actually be happy to use biometric authentication as well, according to a recent survey from BT. And for me, that leads to the two key points of why you'd look to use your voice to authenticate you in a business. Firstly, it's user convenience. Ultimately, it's a very frictionless, very seamless way. It just works. So, for example, if we liken that sort of frictionless experience to something like Uber, we don't have to stand looking for a cab in central London getting rained on now. We hail the cab, on the app. The Uber turns up, we jump in, away we go. It's a very frictionless experience. The same applies to voice biometrics. And security, that's the second key point. So we've all seen, as I said earlier, the breaches and the fines, such as the one that British Airways had recently. Brand protection is absolutely paramount, and ensuring that the customer trusts us and that we're treating their personal data and security as sacrosanct is absolutely key. So what are the steps during that biometric process? Well, again, we'll use that speech recognition interface, and we go through a sort of three-step process. And step one is enrollment. So there is a one-time process where we will take that individual through the enrollment cycle and train the platform to listen to their voice print and create that initial voice print with an understanding of the waypoints across the phonetic elements of that customer's voice. And that's typically done with the sort of 3 to 4 phrases being used, and then we'll bank that. Step two then is verification. So the customer is then verified against who they claim they are, against the voice print that we hold against them. Again, we can get around GDPR considerations because we're holding something that's effectively a replication of that voice print. Without the authentication step, there is no personally identifiable information held within that voice print. And then finally, we've got adaptation as well. So after initial enrollment, a customer's voice print can be updated. It can be trained further to achieve a better level of recognition. And indeed, if marginal verifications or score failures occur, again, we can take that process and train the biometric engine to ensure a greater level of accuracy when that customer calls in to authenticate. Within that, we have 2 verification modes as well. First, we would refer to as text dependent. So this is a sort of an active challenge response that we're looking for. So again, within the IVR sort of auto attendant layer, we'd actually have a challenge to that customer and look for a specific passphrase or passcode. For example, there, my voice will let me in, and we will then again look at the verification against the voice print that's held on record, and we will decide whether that is the real caller or an imposter. Transfer through to an agent, again with the CTI data appended to that call so that they can crack on with their task and discuss the account details with the customer. The other mechanism is more passive than that, and it's called text independent. So this is where we are effectively listening in on the call with the agent, and this to me is the sort of ultimate in seamless, frictionless ID&V. So it's sort of security without the customer even really being aware of it. So as I said, we will listen into that call, and in conversation with the agent, the voice biometric engine will look at the customer's voice as they're speaking in natural language, and we'll actually alert the agent during the call, perhaps with a traffic light system or a yes, no, if that customer is who they say they are and claiming to be, so that we can get into the account detail. So where do we look for in a project like this, with the return on investment? How do we actually start to sort of build the business case? Well, there are various metrics that we'd sort of look towards to actually see improvement in this. So time to answer, AHT, being another one. So, you know, how can we actually reduce that? Well, clearly we're taking away a chunk of the call up front, and this will reduce the average handle time for the agent during each of those calls. Now, what we're seeing more and more is actually some customers saying, well, we're not really that fussed about AHT. In fact, we actually just want to have better conversations with our customers. So actually, well, maybe use that 38 seconds, maybe more, maybe less, to actually improve the types of conversation and the level of detail you're getting into to deliver a better overall service experience with the customer. And again, instead of a time saving, let's look at the benefit of moving our Net Promoter Score, our CSAT score, you know, a couple of points to the right, because again, there is a clear financial return that's been proven many times on improving those scores. Adherence to schedule as well. Well, what does it mean if I can get my agents in the right place at the right time doing the right things? Again, there is a clear cost benefit to any organization with that. First contact resolution, you know, again, ensuring that the right agent is able to cope and handle with that call if the customer is gone through that verification process, and we're able to then resolve that call on the first contact. Again, there is a clear benefit then with a reduction in repeat calls. Ultimately, cost per call goes down. The cost per handle, again, if we look back to the AHT as well, again, depending on how we want to use that metric as a business, again, we can roll that in to a reduction on cost per call, or we can actually use that time to buy ourselves a better service, essentially. All this results in a lower cost per transaction. And finally, what is the cost for reducing that fraud within the business? Every business has an issue to a greater or lesser extent with fraud. Well, what does it mean that if we could, you know, remove that or a majority of that fraud from an organization? You know, the results can be very, very significant. So we have a team here, a team of consultants who are able to help build and model these key areas, you know, based on the ROI and business case to help support the integration and adoption of these technologies we're talking about today. So we have a question here, and really this question is sort of an encapsulation of these sort of key points, and it's, you know, what is the metric that you know feel is most important to improve out of the following on the list? So we can starting to see those come through now. Just got the last few coming through by the look of it. Great, I think we're ready to, oh, still got a couple more coming in. I think we're ready to publish. So it's a pretty even spread, which is interesting. It'll be interesting to look at the sort of split and spread of businesses that we've got. But ultimately, we can see there that just out in front is that reduction of customer effort. And actually, that makes a lot of sense. I think, you know, clearly in the reduction of that customer effort, you know, we can have a number of knock-on effects and benefits there as well. Thank you very much for that. So, looking at that in practice, well, how does it work in the real world? What's, you know, what can this look like? Well, we'll use a customer example here. So this particular customer of ours is a FTSE listed utility company, and the situation they found themselves in, they're a very heavily regulated industry. The industry regulator is Ofwat, and they will produce punitive fines in the multi-millions of pounds for poor service. Very, very significant. On top of that pressure as well, market deregulation was coming as well. So for the first time ever, for business, for example, businesses are able to now purchase their water in the same way that we purchase our electricity and gas at home. So, you know, you could be buying Scottish water if you're based in the Thames Valley, for example. So this deregulation of the market meant it was the competition edge, which is something that the water industry hadn't seen before, was coming. So they needed to really make steps to try and attract, retain customers and differentiate themselves, you know, through the service that they were providing. But that came with a number of challenges as well. So clearly, staffing up to ensure that every call was delivered within the SLA which they expected. Every call answered within X number of rings. It's very, very expensive to do that, and for and at sort of peak times, you might be busy, but then as soon as that peak drops off, you'll have agents sat there idle, and that's very, very expensive. But ultimately, you've got to then flip that round. That might be the situation on the internal side of things, but then externally, you could end up with frustrated customers. Frustrated customers are proven to drive up average handling time. In fact, studies have shown that a frustrated customer can actually push up AHT on a call by 3 to 4 minutes. Ultimately, that then has a negative impact because, again, you're going to struggle to hit your adherence to schedule. Staff are going to be caught up in knots trying to calm the customers down before they can get into the meat of the call. And there's a cost and reputational damage to that as well. You're not going to deliver that service line. And ultimately, Water as well, they were having issues with accounts in arrears as well. So, all businesses experience, frustration from trying to chase down money, be it business or consumer. But actually, there is an EU regulation which states you cannot switch off somebody's water supply. So, gas and electric companies will happily cut you off if you don't pay your bill. That's what I'm told. However, water companies, because it's a fundamental human right, are unable to do that. So they were having big issues with their accounts in arrears as well. So we worked with them and looked at, where were some of the key areas that we could help address to deliver some benefit and allow them to do more with less, essentially. And we saw that identification and verification, which was a process that the agents were manually doing, was a particular pain point within the business. So we recommended speech recognition and our ID&V application, which is being run across every inbound call now within their contact center. And that was combined as well with some computer telephony integration to their Microsoft Dynamics CRM system to allow the screen pop, but also a rich data transfer. So we had a separate application, a lightweight application that popped up to tell those agents what had actually happened within the IVR. Had they been able to answer all of those questions correctly, and were they able to proceed with the call? And that rich data transfer as well, because they were times having to push those internal transfers around the business, was then appended to the call and presented to the next agent in that process as well. So again, lowering that customer effort, and again, one of the other ongoing frustrations which their customer feedback had raised, which was around this multiple identification and verification process they were having to go to when they'd already got into the business. So all sounds great, but what was the business case that we recognized within that? Well, on first deployment, so without any tuning whatsoever, our IVR achieved 86% containment rate. So it meant we were able to achieve an ID&V on 86% of those callers into the contact center, which was very, very impressive, and they were very, very pleased with. It saved 45 seconds on average of every time. They had a very robust ID&V process and some very, very stringent data protection guys in there, and there was 4 randomized questions from 6 which the customers have to go through on every single call. So 45 seconds was a dramatic saving. What did that mean? Actually, from a bottom line business case perspective, that in the first year, the annual savings from deploying this technology were actually in excess of £600,000. Suffice to say, the return on investment for the initial purchase of the solution was achieved very, very quickly, and the savings from year 2, 3 onwards are even greater than that again. So, the technology is real, it's here, it works, and those sort of numbers speak for themselves in terms of the benefit that you can deliver and derive from its adoption. So that concludes the sort of formal slides of the presentation. As I said, from my perspective, in summary, I would suggest that really we need to be looking now as contact centers at those sort of 2 key points, which I mentioned earlier. Let's give our customers a seamless, frictionless experience that just works. Let's make it convenient, number 1. And number two, let's keep that focus on security to protect our brand and, most importantly, to protect our customers. So thank you very much for attending today, and I'll now open up to some questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, feel free to type it into the questions panel in the GoToWebinar icon, and we'll start to field them for you as they start to come through. So we've had a couple of questions already, so let me see if I can start with this. So we've had the first one, which is, does it work with our Mitel telephone system? Well, yes, is the short answer. So the solution itself is actually agnostic to telephony. So whether you have an Avaya, a Genesis, a Cisco, a Mitel in the case of this attendee, then yeah, we can work across that, and we're agnostic to that. So typical ROI for our ID&V solution in months, it varies, to be honest, depending on the size of the contact center, the current ID&V process. So yeah, it does vary. We've had ROIs of in a SaaS deployment, we've had month one ROIs. In CapEx ROIs, often a bit longer, but typically well within 12 months. So it's a sort of a case-by-case basis, obviously depending on the sort of customer landscape. But obviously we'd be happy to work with you guys to look at where those benefits might be derided. Typical implementation as well. So we've got a couple of questions around that. So again, it would vary on the size of the program and also the complexity. But yeah, I think as one of the questions is sort of hazarded a guess at, 3 months is probably a typical implementation timeline on a sort of end-to-end project. We then have a sort of period of ongoing tuning where we obviously support the customer ongoing to ensure that we can really get the system singing and getting those hit rates absolutely at the maximum. Another question is, how accurate is speech recognition? Well, that is a good question. So single word accuracy. So if you look at the Nuance, so Nuance sort of the global leader in terms of speech recognition software, and they would tell you that single word accuracy is probably around sort of mid 80%, 80-85%, something like that. Now, however, the reality of that is that actually where we deliver then that sort of skill and expertise, we take that sort of underlying speech recognition engine, and it's the way then we construct the voice user interface questions that we go through. So for example, you might get a reasonable 80% hit rate with a postcode. So you utter a postcode, speech recognition engine listens to it, and actually then we might return, let's say 20, 30 possible postcodes which sound like the postcode that's just been uttered. Well, actually, we've already then filtered that down. If we then move on to something like a date of birth, we can filter that down further. And by the time we've gone through that process, if we haven't already done it on the initial hit on postcode, we'll have certainly done it within the next couple of questions. So it's a sort of combination of that initial speech recognition, but then actually the retrieval of the data and filtering of the data down to ensure that you get that correct. The biometric layer in itself is extremely accurate. The voice prints are unique, so yeah, there is no should we say there is a sort of no validation concerns around that ever being sort of spoofed or fooled. We've got another question here, which is, what level of in-house development skills tech would be required to support this? So we deliver this essentially as a sort of turnkey project for most of our customers. Yes, the development of speech recognition voice biometrics is a fairly specialized skill. However, what we would look for from a customer is a sort of API really to connect into their their CRM platform. But where an API doesn't exist, we can actually use robotic process automation. So we can actually use digital workers who effectively act as an agent and go in through the normal user interface, and we can actually package up the speech recognition data, push that in text format to the digital worker, who then inputs it and gives us a response back. And that's actually totally unique to IPI. We're the first company in the world who's actually been able to deliver that solution. So if an API doesn't exist, or a customer isn't able to expose that for whatever reason, it could be an old system, legacy database, a third-party system that they can't get access to, we can still deliver that integration by the implementation of a robot worker as well. So let's have a look. I think we've got a couple more questions. Yeah. So in order to use Voice Biometrics, how many times does a customer have to call into the contact center for it to work? Is it set up on the first call and then works automatically on further calls? Yeah, great question. And as I said, yeah, there is an enrollment process that we go through. And that is where on that first contact in, we push that customer into a voice user interface that will take, a number of utterances of a repeated phrase where we capture that voice print. So it's a one-time setup. It will then work automatically every time the customer calls in on subsequent calls, throughout that life cycle. And what we also do is repeatedly learn and train that dialogue as well. So again, we can every time the customer calls in and goes through that process, we can add that to the existing understanding of that voice print to really train it. So any machine learning AI component to the ID&V to improve accuracy? Yeah, again, as I said, we're able to integrate our technology with various different AI and chatbot type solutions as well, to further derive benefit and recognition accuracy from that as well. And then how quickly can this be implemented? Yeah, so as we've sort of alluded to before, we'd be typically looking at sort of 3-4 month type deployment cycle for this. It can be slightly longer, but then we've also had instances where it's been slightly quicker. But that's the sort of elapsed project time that I would suggest. So I think that's it. There's some great questions there. So thank you very much for that. A copy of the webinar, if you enjoyed it so much that you'd like to watch it again, will be available and sent out to everyone. But just lastly, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance this morning. I hope you found the session useful, and look forward to speaking to you all again soon on our next webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good day.